Section 1 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1, The Water, by Elizabeth Oakes Smith. How beautiful the water is! Didst ever think of it, when down it tumbles from the skies, as in a merry fit? It jostles, ringing as it falls, on all that's in its way. I hear it dancing on the roof, like some wild thing at play. 'Tis rushing now adown the spout, and gushing out below, half frantic in its joyousness, and wild in eager flow. The earth is dried and parched with heat, and it hath longed to be released from out the selfish cloud, to cool the thirsty tree. It washes rather rudely too the floweret's simple grace, as if to chide the pretty thing for dust upon its face. It scours the tree till every leaf is free from dust or stain, then waits till leaf and branch are stilled, and showers them o'er again. Drop after drop is trickling down to kiss the stirring brook. The water dimples from beneath with its own joyous look. And then the kindred drops embrace, and singing on they go, to dance beneath the willow tree, and glad the vale below. How beautiful the water is! It loves to come at night, to make you wonder in the morn, to see the earth so bright, to find a youthful gloss is spread on every shrub and tree, and flowerets breathing on the air their odours pure and free. A dainty thing the water is, it loves the floweret's cup, to nestle mid the odours there, and fill its petals up. It hangs its gems on every leaf, like diamonds in the sun, and then the water wins the smile the floweret should have won. How beautiful the water is! To me 'tis wondrous fair. No spot can ever lonely be, if water sparkles there. It hath 1,000 tongues of mirth, of grandeur or delight, and every heart is gladder made when water greets the sight. End of section 1. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 2 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Faithann Gibson. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2. The Coquette and the Two Suitors, with an engraving by Seba Smith. What an exquisite piece of humanity is the finished Coquette. Oh, but doesn't she tease the beau, though? I guess she does a few, said Ichabod, to whom my remark was addressed. Well, isn't she a queer thing? I mean one of your real handsome, bright, brilliant, heartless flirts. Is there anything in heaven or earth that is at all like her? I shouldn't look in them air places if I wanted to find something most like her, said Ichabod, giving his quid an extra turn in his mouth. Shouldn't look in heaven or earth for her likeness. Where then, pray, would you look? In that 'ere t'other place, down below, said Ichabod very gravely. What is there to liken her to there? Well, the very old feller himself, if you please, said Ichabod. Him that some folks call Beelzebub. Ah, now you are getting rather too savage, Ichabod. But how do you prove that a coquette is anything like Beelzebub? Because she goes about like a roaring lamb, seeking whom she may devour. Well, there's no getting over that logic, Ichabod, nor round it neither, that's a fact. But is there nothing on earth that is like her? Why, yes, said Ichabod. You may liken her to a frolicking boy, if you please, who draws a string about the floor among a flock of kittens. The kittens, you know, will creep up softly and carefully toward the string, and their eyes will grow fiery, and their heads will turn round and round, whichever way the string turns, and when they fetch a desperate spring to get hold of it, the boy gives the string a whisk, away out of their reach, and then they turn about and cry mew, and are all ready to be teased again. Capital! Ichabod, your similes are irresistible. But now you have succeeded so well on the earth, and in that other place down below, suppose you try to grow more elevated, and see if you can't find a likeness above, too. Say now, don't a bright-eyed, beautiful, languishing, fascinating Coquette remind you of the angels in heaven? No, not exactly the angels in heaven, said Ichabod, but she reminds me at the same time of the Saviour in heaven, and a fallen angel in that nameless lower sphere. How so, Ichabod? How can she possibly remind you at the same time of two spiritual natures so entirely opposite? Why, I'll tell you, said Ichabod. When some poor bewildered mortal has become entangled in the snare of her blandishments, she leads the dizzy and dazzled captive up into the high places of the affections, and shows him all the kingdoms of her charms, tempting him 40 days, and when he falls down to worship her, she turns up her nose or laughs in his face and says, "Get thee behind me, Satan!" Seems to me, Ichabod, that this is what I should call rather a mixed metaphor. I can't help that, said Ichabod. There 'tis, and you may call it what you are a mind to. But what has this to do with Miss Laura Matilda Peachblossom, that you began to tell me something about? We have been dealing altogether in generals. I should like to come down to particulars now. Detail, individuality, Ichabod, is always the most interesting. The lone sufferer in the solitary wilderness, sick, wounded, or dying, with only a faithful dog perhaps to watch over him and witness his expiring struggles, excites our sympathies more than a whole army of soldiers cut down in a heap and dying by thousands. That Laura Matilda is a real peeler, isn't she? Peeler, said Ichabod. I guess you may well say that, for she peels the skin off the hearts of the beaux that flock around her as fast as an Irish cook would peel potatoes. Ichabod, you shall be made professor of rhetoric in the first new college that is established. Your eloquent illustrations surpass anything I ever heard. But how is it that Miss Laura Matilda peels hearts with so much skill and rapidity? Well, I'll just tell you, said Ichabod, how she did up a couple of 'em last night. Poor things, how I did pity them. I didn't know for a while but the skin of my own heart would peel off of itself, just out of sympathy for them. Charles Fitzgerald Stanley, you know Charles, called early in the evening. Laura was, of course, dressed in the pink of the mode. She always is when she sees callers, and she took her seat in her large lolling chair, pointing Charles to a seat just before her. And if they didn't have a cosy, happy time for about 2 hours, I'm mistaken. I was walking about in the next room nursing a cold, and as the door was open, I couldn't help having a glance occasionally that showed me how the game went on. She levelled the whole artillery of her charms upon him. Flashing eyes, rosy cheeks, dimpled chin, white teeth, bewitching smiles, all were brought to bear, and all did execution. And then her languishing, confiding, coaxing air did the business for poor Charles. His mind was made up. He was in his kingdom come. I have no doubt he believed in his very soul that they should be married in a fortnight. Charles had risen to go, and was leaning against the mantel with his cane in one hand and his hat in the other, saying a few more agreeable things before his parting, when the bell rung, and the servant came tripping in to tell Miss Laura that Mr. Richard Wise had called. "Oh dear," said Laura, "is that stupid fellow here again? Why, he was here last evening, and stayed till I was so tired of him I thought I should have to tell him to go. But I must see him, I suppose. Ask him in." These remarks, of course, except the last, were all directed to Charles, and not the servant. In a moment Richard was ushered in, and shook hands with Miss Laura with a great deal of familiarity and warmth. Charles was a little surprised at the apparent cordiality and warmth of manner with which Laura received Richard, but still he set it down to the credit of her amiable disposition and her unwillingness to wound his feelings. After a slight recognition of Charles, who was still leaning against the mantel, Richard very coolly took his seat in the vacant chair, and commenced an animated conversation with Laura, the whole of which showed that he felt himself very much at home. Charles was very much disgusted at his conduct, and looked upon him with the most perfect contempt. He had almost a good mind to insult him at once and make him leave the house, as a particular favour to his adorable Laura. Miss Laura was leaning back in her chair, and flourishing a screen before her face, which enabled her to look at either of the suitors as she pleased, and at the same time hide her own face from the other. When her screen was held so Charles could not see her face, she would bestow her most fascinating smiles and confiding looks upon Richard, and then give a frown and a wink the other way, as much as to say to Richard, "I wish that Charles was in the East Indies." And then she would change the position of the screen and converse with Charles, with such soul-beaming eyes and gentle loveliness that he fairly believed her heart was all his, and then her winks and nods in the other direction convinced him that she felt Richard to be a most intolerable bore. If it had not been for the rudeness of the thing in the presence of a lady, he would at once have kicked him out of the house. At any rate, he would not leave the house while that impudent intruder remained there. Almost the same thoughts were passing through the mind of Richard. He regarded himself as the especial favourite of Laura, and considered the conduct of Charles in loitering there so long as the coolest piece of impudence he had ever seen. This state of things continued from 10:30, the time that Richard came in, till 12:30, when old Mrs. Peach Blossom sent the servant in to tell Miss Laura that her father wished to speak with her. At this hint, the two suitors took their leave, both casting heavenly smiles upon Miss Laura, and the most awful frowns upon each other. Laura flirted away to her room with an air that showed she didn't care the crack of her fan for either of them. "Well, what'll be the end of it, Ichabod?" "I shouldn't be surprised," said Ichabod. "They are such courageous, bloodthirsty fellows, to hear before tomorrow night that it had ended in a duel." End of section 2.
Section 3 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. Ben Blower's Story, or How to Relish a Julep, by C. F. Hoffman. It was the cholera season of 1834. I was lost in my cogitations as I reclined upon the settee of a steamer, sipping the balmy corrective of the drastic Mississippi waters, whose yeasty current foamed around me. Methought, as I looked upon what many then considered the great fluid agent of the pestilence throughout the growing Southwest, methought a man must be there, in that greasy, fumed, overcrowded boat, beneath that scorching sky, there where the great gloomy river writhed its turbid way amid endless swamps of cypress. A man must be there in that desolate wilderness alone, for that heated random crowd was not society, though it robbed one of the elevating sense of solitude in a scene so vast. Alone, anxious and ailing, and but now almost completely disheartened by a long struggle amid jostling passengers to get his chance for a cooling draught at the bar, he must in short be situated exactly as I was, to realize the full and perfect relishment of a julep. I had yet to learn that I knew not the consummate condition of julep drinking. There was a buzz among the passengers, as if some new event had turned up to vary the monotony of the day. "Are you sure that's the Flame, over by the shore?" asked a man near me of one of the deckhands. "Certing, Manny. I could tell her pipes across the Missouri." The name Missouri is thus generally pronounced upon the western waters. "And you will overhaul her?" "Won't we, though? I tell ye, stranger, so sure as my name's Ben Blower, that last tar barrel I hove in the furnace has put just the smart chance of go-ahead into us to cut off the Flame from yonder pint, or send our boat to kingdom come." "The devil!" exclaimed a bystander, who, intensely interested in the race, was leaning the while against the partitions of the boiler-room. "I've chosen a nice place to see the fun, near this infernal powder-barrel." "Not so bad as if you were in it," coolly observed Ben to me as the other walked rapidly away. "As if he were in it? In what? In the boiler?" "Certing. Don't folks sometimes go into bilers, Manny?" "I should think there'd be other parts of the boat more comfortable." "That's right, poking fun at me at onct. But wait till we get through this brush with the old Flame, and I'll tell ye of a regular fixing scrape that a man may get into. It's true, too, every word of it, as sure as my name's Ben Blower." The hoped-for race did indeed much to my personal comfort prove but a brush, and I lighted a cigar with a tolerable assurance of being able to smoke it out in quiet before our boat could have another chance of testing the strength of her boiler, while the worthy Ben took up his story with that spirit and earnestness which is often called out mesmerically by attentive listening. You have seen the flame, then, afore, stranger? 6 years ago, when new upon the river, she was a rail out and outer, I tell ye. I was at that time a hand aboard of her. Yes, I belonged to her at the time of her great race with the Goliar. You've hearn mayhap of the blow-up by which we lost it. They made a great fuss about it, but it was nothing but a mere fizz of hot water after all, only the springing of a few rivets, which loosened a biler plate or two, and let out a thin spurting upon some niggers that hadn't sense enough to get out of the way. Well, the Goliar took off our passengers, and we ran into Smasher's Landing to repair damages and bury the poor fools that were killed. Here we laid for a matter of 30 hours or so, and got things to rights on board for a brand new start. There was some carpenter's work yet to be done, but the captain said that might be fixed off just as well when we were under way. We had worked hard, the weather was sour, and we needn't do anything more just now. We might take that afternoon to ourselves, but the next morning he'd get up steam bright and early, and we'd all come out new. There was no temperance society at Smasher's Landing, and I went ashore upon a lark with some of the hands. I omit the worthy Benjamin's adventures upon land, and despairing of fully conveying his language in its original Doric force, will not hesitate to give the rest of his singular narrative in my own words, save where, in a few instances, I can recall his precise phraseology, which the reader will easily recognize. The night was raw and sleety when I regained the deck of our boat. The officers, instead of leaving a watch above, had closed up everything and shut themselves in the cabin. The fire-room only was open. The boards, dashed from the outside by the explosion, had not yet been replaced. The floor of the room was wet, and there was scarcely a corner which afforded a shelter from the driving storm. I was about leaving the room, resigned to sleep in the open air, and now bent only upon getting under the lee of some bulkhead that would protect me against the wind. In passing out, I kept my arms stretched forward to feel my way in the dark, but my feet came in contact with a heavy iron lid. I stumbled, and as I fell, struck one of my hands into the manhole. I think this was the name he gave to the oval-shaped opening in the head of the boiler, through which the smith had entered to make his repairs. I fell with my arm thrust so far into the aperture that I received a pretty smart blow in the face as it came in contact with the head of the boiler, and I did not hesitate to drag my body after it the moment I recovered from this stunning effect and ascertained my whereabouts. In a word, I crept into the boiler, resolved to pass the rest of the night there. The place was dry and sheltered. Had my bed been softer, I would have had all that man could desire. As it was, I slept, and slept soundly. I should mention, though, that before closing my eyes, I several times shifted my position. I'd gone first to the farther end of the boiler. Then again I had crawled back to the manhole to put my hand out and feel that it was really still open. The warmest place was at the farther end, where I finally established myself, and that I knew from the first. It was foolish in me to think that the opening through which I had just entered could be closed without my hearing it, and that too when no one was astir but myself. But the blow on the side of my face made me a little nervous, perhaps. Besides, I never could bear to be shut up in any place. It always gives a wild-like feeling about the head. You may laugh, stranger, but I believe I should suffocate in an empty church if I once felt that I was so shut up in it that I could not get out. I have met men afore now just like me, or worse, rather, much worse, men that it made sort of furious to be tied down to anything, yet so soft-like and contradictory in their natures that you might lead them anywhere, so long as they didn't feel the string. Stranger, it takes all sorts of people to make a world, and we may have a good many of the worst kind of white men here, out west, but I have seen folks upon the river, quiet-looking chaps too, as ever you see, who were so teetotally cantankerous that they'd shoot the doctor who'd tell them they couldn't live when ailing and make a die of it just out of spite when told they must get well. Yes, fellows as fond of the good things of earth as you or I, yet who'd rush like mad right over the gangplank of life, if once brought to believe that they had to stay in this world whether they wanted to leave it or not. Thunder and bees, if such a fellow as that had heard the cocks crow as I did, awakened to find darkness about him, darkness so thick you might cut it with a knife, heard other sounds too to tell that it was morning, and scrambling to fumble for that manhole found it too black, closed, black, and even as the rest of the iron coffin around him, closed with not a rivet hole to let God's light and air in, why, he'd swoonded right down on the spot as I did, and I ain't ashamed to own it to no white man. The big drops actually stood upon the poor fellow's brow as he now paused for a moment in the recital of his terrible story. He passed his hand over his rough features and resumed it with less agitation of manner. How long I may have remained there senseless, I don't know. The doctors have since told me it must have been a sort of fit, more like an apoplexy than a swoon, for the attack finally passed off in sleep. Yes, I slept, I know that, for I dreamed a heap of things afore I woke. There is but one dream, however, that I have ever been able to recall distinctly, and that must have come on shortly before I recovered my consciousness. My resting place through that night had been, as I have told you, at the far end of the boiler. Well, I now dreamed that the manhole was still open, and what seems curious rather than laughable if you take it in connection with other things, I fancied that my legs had been so stretched in the long walk I had taken the evening before that they now reached the whole length of the boiler and extended through the opening. At first, in my dreaming reflections, it was a comfortable thought that no one could now shut up the manhole without awakening me, but soon it seemed as if my feet, which were on the outside, were becoming drenched in the storm which had originally driven me to seek this shelter. I felt the chilling rain upon my extremities. They grew colder and colder, and their numbness gradually extended upward to other parts of my body. It seemed, however, that it was only the underside of my person that was thus strangely visited. I laid upon my back, and it must have been a species of nightmare that afflicted me, for I knew at last that I was dreaming, yet felt it impossible to rouse myself. A violent fit of coughing restored at last my powers of volition. The water, which had been slowly rising around me, had rushed into my mouth. I awoke to hear the rapid strokes of the pump, which was driving it into the boiler. My whole condition, no, not all of it, not yet, my present condition flashed with new horror upon me, but I did not again swoon. The choking sensation which had made me faint when I first discovered how I was entombed gave way to a livelier, though less overpowering emotion. I shrieked even as I started from my slumber. The previous discovery of the closed aperture, with the instant oblivion that followed, seemed only a part of my dream, and I threw my arms about and looked eagerly for the opening by which I had entered the horrid place. Yes, looked for it and felt for it, though it was the terrible conviction that it was closed, a second time brought home to me, which prompted my frenzied cry. Every sense seemed to have tenfold acuteness, yet not one to act in unison with another. I shrieked again and again, imploringly, desperately, savagely. I filled the hollow chamber with my cries, till its iron walls seemed to tingle around me. The dull strokes of the accursed pump seemed only to mock at, while they deadened my screams. At last I gave myself up. It is the struggle against our fate which frenzies the mind. We cease to fear when we cease to hope. I gave myself up, and then I grew calm. I was resigned to die, resigned even to my mode of death. It was not, I thought, so very new, after all, as to awaken unwonted horror in a man. Thousands have been sunk to the bottom of the ocean, shut up in the hulls of vessels, beating themselves against the battened hatches, dragged down from the upper world, shrieking, not for life but for death, only beneath the eye and amid the breath of heaven. Thousands have endured that appalling kind of suffocation. I would die only as many a better man had died before me. I could meet such a death. I said so, I thought so, I felt so, I mean, for a minute or more. 10 minutes it may have been, or but an instant of time, I know not, nor does it matter if I could compute it. There was a time then when I was resigned to my fate, but good God, was I resigned to it in the shape in which next it came to appall me? Stranger, I felt that water growing hot about my limbs, though it was yet mid-leg deep. I felt it, and in the same moment heard the roar of the furnace that was to turn it into steam before it could get deep enough to drown one. You shudder. It was hideous, but did I shrink and shrivel and crumble down upon that iron floor and lose my senses in that horrid agony of fear? No, though my brain swam and the lifeblood that curdled at my heart seemed about to stagnate there forever, still I knew it was too hoarse, too hopeless from my previous efforts to cry out more. But I struck feebly at first and then strongly, frantically with my clenched fist against the sides of the boiler. There were people moving near me who must hear my blows. Could not I hear the grating of chains and shuffling of feet, the very rustle of a rope, hear them all within a few inches of me? I did, but the gurgling water that was growing hotter and hotter around my extremities made more noise within the steaming cauldron than did my frenzied blows against its sides. Latterly, I had hardly changed my position, but now the growing heat of the water made me plash to and fro. Lifting myself wholly out of it was impossible, but I could not remain quiet. I stumbled upon something. It was a mallet, a chance tool the smith had left there by accident. With what wild joy did I seize it! With what eager confidence did I now deal my first blows with it against the walls of my prison! But scarce had I intermitted them for a moment when I heard the clang of the iron door as the fireman flung it wide to feed the flames that were to torture me. My knocking was unheard, though I could hear him toss the sticks into the furnace beneath me and drive to the door when his infernal oven was fully crammed. Had I yet a hope? I had, but it rose in my mind, side by side with the fear that I might now become the agent of preparing myself a more frightful death. Yes, when I thought of that furnace with its fresh-fed flames curling beneath the iron upon which I stood, a more frightful death even than that of being boiled alive. Had I discovered that mallet but a short time sooner, but no matter, I would by its aid resort to the only expedient now left. It was this: I remembered having a marline spike in my pocket, and in less time than I have taken in hinting at the consequences of thus using it, I had made an impression upon the sides of the boiler, and soon succeeded in driving it through. The water gushed through the aperture. Would they see it? No, the jet could only play against a wooden partition, which must hide the stream from view. It must trickle down upon the deck before the leakage would be discovered. Should I drive another hole to make that leakage greater? Why, the water within seemed already to be sensibly diminished. So hot had become that which remained. Should more escape, would I not hear it bubble and hiss upon the fiery plates of iron that were already scorching the soles of my feet? Ah, there is a movement. Voices, I hear them calling for a crowbar. The bulkhead cracks as they pry off the planking. They have seen the leak. They are trying to get at it. Good God, why do they not first dampen the fire? Why do they call for the stranger? Look at that finger. It can never regain its natural size, but it has already done all the service that man could expect from so humble a member. Sir, that hole would have been plugged up on the instant, unless I had jammed my finger through. I heard the cry of horror as they saw it without, the shout to drown the fire, the first stroke of the cold water pump. They say, too, that I was conscious when they took me out, but I remember nothing more till they brought a julep to my bedside afterward. And that julep, cooling was it? Stranger. Ben turned away his head and wept. He could no more. Wild scenes in the forest and prairie. End of section 3. Section 4 of the Rover, Volume 1, number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, number 26, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4, The Last Days of Timothy Tuttle, by Nathaniel Deering. It may be that the reader whose good fortune it was to peruse the 21st number of the Rover has not forgotten one Timotheus Tuttle, who discharged the important functions of teacher in Tabbyville in the 3rd District and of chorister in the West Parish. If so, he may also recollect that we therein alluded to a probable enlargement of the meeting house in consequence of the popularity of Parson Briggs. Everything that was then contemplated touching the meeting house is now a matter of history. It has been separated in the middle. The timber for the additional 15 feet was cut last winter, and Squire Peebles, who took the work on contract, says it will certainly be finished in all July. An alteration of so much magnitude has caused no little excitement in the village, and when the landlord of the Tabbyville house suggested the propriety of a second dedication, it was at once determined on, with scarcely a dissenting voice. Parson Briggs, however, considered it hardly expedient, as the labor of preparation would occasion a waste of time and money, which at that busy season might be more profitably employed. But he failed to convince a majority of the parish, who were desirous of a holiday, and who therefore regarded the arguments of mine host of the Tabbyville house as much more weighty. The latter omitted no opportunity to address the parson on this interesting topic, and at last remarked that as his family were to occupy one of the new pews, he should hardly consider himself within the droppings of the sanctuary if that important ceremony were omitted. But Parson Briggs knew well enough that the landlord took a deeper interest in the Tabbyville house than in the house of prayer, and that all his exertions arose from the crowded rooms which he might reasonably expect on such an occasion. In reply, therefore, he merely remarked, as he turned on his heel, that he should have less fears both for the landlord and his guests, if in their anxiety for the droppings of the sanctuary they would be as anxious to avoid the droppings of the bar-room. But of all those who seconded our landlord's views, none was more zealous than Master Tuttle. The reason was obvious. As chorister he would play no ordinary part, it devolving on him not only to select the dedication anthem, but to lead also in the performance of it. The first was a task of no small difficulty, for though there were many pieces suited to the occasion, there was not one that was suited to the choir. This was owing to the sundry flats and sharps that abounded more or less in every anthem that was in any way appropriate, and which were always stumbling blocks to the amateurs who formed his orchestra. Squire Snoodles, who was designated by Tuttle as his primo flauto, said he had inherited from his mother an antipathy to everything sharp, and Dr. Snaggs, who endeavored to operate on a clarinet, maintained that his instrument was defective except on the natural key. As to Captain Tarbox, the second violin, he knew as much about notes as he did about hieroglyphics, and sorely tried the patience of Master Tuttle in his endeavors to render him an available in the West Parish Musical Association. At length Master Tuttle, after mature deliberation, concluded to compose a grand dedication anthem, at once appropriate and sublime, and so remarkable for simplicity that even Tarbox, he said, should get the hang of it. With this anthem he was in travail for some time, and certainly in its adaptation to the powers of those for whom it was especially designed. It evinced in the composer no small skill and judgment. He had his solos and duettos and trios after the manner of all standard composers, and his accompaniment was so arranged as to enable each performer to exhibit his powers with scarcely the hazard of a failure. To ensure this, the part assigned to Captain Tarbox consisted entirely of semibreves and minims, and these were generally confined to the key note. There were, indeed, occasional thirds and fifths, but these appeared at such long intervals that they were regarded by the captain as strange sail on a different tack than as friendly bottoms bound on the same voyage. Dr. Snaggs, having had more acquaintance with the divine art, was allowed to breathe in crotchets, some of which were marked staccato, while Snoodles, who was Tuttle's pupil, had, in addition to these the indulgence of a brace of trills, and one whole bar ad libitum. It was in the bass, however, that the genius of the composer was unquestionably evinced, a part which he intended to perform on his own viol, and to which none but himself could do adequate justice. Here semiquavers and demi-semiquavers were arranged in formidable array, moving, as it were, en echelon, and he had even ventured a chromatic passage. Chapter 2. The month of June had nearly elapsed ere Tuttle had finished the work, which he fondly anticipated would entitle him to the appellation of the American Handel. It was generally understood that the dedication would take place in a fortnight, and as this allowed but little time for rehearsal, he requested the choir to assemble at least 3 evenings a week till that eventful moment. The composer himself, however, was scarcely adequate to the task he had undertaken, being greatly exhausted by his preparatory labors and extreme solicitude touching the anthem, together with the responsibility of his office, of which he was fully conscious, had moreover induced a morbid nervous excitement that was frequently the subject of remark. This was now increased by the absence of Snoodles on the first and second rehearsal, by the continual blunders of Captain Tarbox, and by his own exertions in the alto, for which his voice was in every respect unfitted. This part had been arranged expressly for Joe Slocum, whose tones had so delighted him at the Mug and Poker, and who, at Tuttle's earnest entreaties, had consented to visit Tabbyville and practice with the choir. 1 week, however, had elapsed, and yet this important personage was unaccountably absent. On the evening of the 4th rehearsal, which was prolonged to a late hour, Tuttle was unremitting in his exertions to render the performance worthy of the piece and of the occasion. Now animating some, now restraining others, he showed by the movements of his hands and feet and countenance that he was completely absorbed in the harmonious combinations which his genius had called forth. At one time, after repeated trials, there was a probability that his wishes would be crowned with success, but unluckily in the concluding chorus, Captain Tarbox, either forgetful of certain rests or carried away by the sublimity of the passage, madly shot ahead and was flourishing on the key of C, while the choir were hard after him on the notes adjoining. It reminded one of Milton's description of the infernal gates, grating harsh thunder. Master Tuttle dropped his viol in despair. "It is well," he exclaimed, "for the reputation of Job that he ain't in my shoes. Such a set of stultissimi stultissimorum, as I say to my scholars." Perspiring, nervous, and vexed, he seized his hat and endeavored to find relief by flying to his own domicile, regardless of the rain that was then falling in torrents. "Why, Mr. Tuttle," exclaimed his better half as soon as he entered, "why, Mr. Tuttle, a fine night truly to be out singing psalms. A man with a thimbleful of brains would be at home with his wife. And why didn't you scrape your feet and leave your coat in the entry? The carpet will be in a pretty pickle while you are as wet as a water rat." "Wet, my dear? I'm as dry as a baked herring, and if you consider my life precious, you can't be too quick in getting a hot mug and a warming pan." Mrs. Tuttle was about to reply with increased bitterness, but the hoarse and feeble tone of her husband startled her, and on observing him more attentively, her anger subsided and her anxiety for his safety. Immediate orders were given for warming the bed, for heating a couple of bricks for the feet, and for steeping some pennyroyal, which was Mrs. Tuttle's infallible specific in all diseases. "My dear," cried Master Tuttle, "wouldn't a little hot flip draw out the cold better than—" "Mr. Tuttle, this is no time for a hot flip, I can tell you, and if it were, it would take so long to heat the poker that— Couldn't you, my dear, contrive to use the leg of the andiron? Husband, you shall swallow pennyroyal if I die for it. I've no idea of being left a poor, disconsolate widow by hearkening to your whims." Upon this, the poor man, as usual, surrendered at discretion, and when Mrs. Tuttle announced that the bed was piping hot, he was nearly smothered beneath the pile of quilts, blankets, and comforters which, in her anxiety to produce a sweat, she had thrown upon him. But the pennyroyal and the warming pan failed in this instance to arrest the progress of the disease, and by the next morning Mrs. Tuttle found her patient in so high a fever that she sent immediately for Mrs. Martin and the widow Biles. These two ladies, though not regular MDs, were celebrated as professors of the healing art, having had much experience in all the ails that usually prevailed in that region, together with a profound knowledge of roots and herbs. At least this merit they had long claimed, and as they were always found at the bedside of the sick, their infallibility seems to have been generally admitted. Each hastened to obey the summons, and they entered the chamber of the sufferer nearly at the same moment. Unfortunately, like some others of the faculty, each had her band of adherents, and each, too, had her favorite herb that must be administered in all cases, regardless of the nature of the complaint. Mrs. Martin rested her claims to distinction on hyssop, while Thoroughwort supported that of the widow Biles. A warm and hardly decorous discussion took place between these rival powers, to the great annoyance of Mr. Tuttle and to the agony of his wife. The anxiety of the latter, however, soon predominated over her reverence for these learned professors, and fearful that ere they had agreed upon a remedy there would be no patient to receive it, she dispatched a messenger in all haste for Dr. Snaggs. And she had good grounds for alarm, for Tuttle's skin was to the touch like that ignited coal, which the learned call anthracite. It was as if the heat of all the flip he had ever drank were now concentrated and glowing upon his husky skin, without one particle of its moisture. To add to her fears, he began to fancy himself in the bar-room of the Mug and Poker. "A second mug, landlord," he exclaimed. "Give it a good sizzle and charge it to Phil Brown." At another moment he would break out with a few bars of his anthem, and then threaten to annihilate Tarbox with his own fiddle. Chapter 3. It was late in the afternoon ere Dr. Snaggs made his appearance. As he entered the room, his step was slow and measured, as a doctor's step of right ought to be, and without uttering a syllable he approached and fixed his eye steadfastly upon the patient. At length he inquired, "What is the state of the viscera, Master Tuttle?" "If B be flat, my is on E." "Ah, erratic," said the doctor. "I must contrive somehow to get a peep at his tongue." At this Master Tuttle started up, and having sounded the pitch, he sung in a loud voice, "Had I the tongues of Greeks and Jews." At the second line he stopped suddenly, then muttered as he sunk upon his pillow, "No matter, no matter, I have the Latin tongue, and egad, how I'll gabble with Virgil in the Elysian fields." Immediately Dr. Snaggs seized the patient's wrist with one hand, and resting his chin upon the large cane which he held in the other, he cast his eye upward. There was a death-like stillness. Mrs. Tuttle ceased bathing her husband's temples and watched the doctor with an anxious look, and even between the rivals there was a cessation of hostilities, so great was their solicitude to learn the result of the doctor's examination. While thus observing him, they noticed a tremulous motion of the lips, and then an ominous shake of the head, which expressed stronger than words the perilous situation of the patient. "Wiry," at length he uttered, "wiry, wiry," and then turning toward Tuttle he asked, "Don't you know me?" "Know thee, that I do. Thou hast been murdering my anthem with a pumpkin vine, and it is a States Pilsen matter. Carcerous, as I say to my scholars." "Alarmingly out," exclaimed Snaggs. "Astonishing aberration. I should have been called sooner. At this late period I hardly feel willing to take the responsibility. It is a critical case, Mrs. Martin. It is a critical case, Mrs. Biles." Both ladies nodded assent. "It is by all means expedient," continued the doctor, "that we retire immediately for consultation. Perhaps by our united efforts we may yet replace the band upon the wheel." "Do you think it's off, doctor?" inquired Mrs. Martin. "Off? Why, I hear the whiz. The wheel moves with so much velocity that even now the gudgeon would burn your hand." "Gracious," said the widow, "he will be all of a torch." Dr. Snaggs now led the way to an adjoining room, and the medical trio prepared with closed doors to investigate the nature of the complaint, and to devise, if possible, some mode of removing it. The only furniture in this apartment consisted of 2 trunks and an armchair. This last was appropriated by the doctor to his own use, and having crossed his legs, he again elevated the cane till it came in contact with his chin. This was his invariable practice when it became necessary to exert some of the higher faculties, as if the neck were too feeble for the ponderous thoughts about to be conjured up, unless strengthened by this additional prop. The trunks were placed on the right and left of the armchair, and so arranged that each formed an obtuse angle with it, thus affording a convenient seat for the ladies. "There is one thing, doctor," said Mrs. Martin, "that I can tell you beforehand, and that is I shall never consent that Master Tuttle take markery. It's an awful poison." "Oh, Dr. Snaggs never gives any outlandish drugs," rejoined the widow. "He always begins with bleeding." Now this was the fact, and had he been first in attendance, he would have practised as usual, and perhaps in this instance with some beneficial result. But he was piqued on finding that Mrs. Tuttle had first sent for such old geese, as he called them, and having some doubts of the patient's recovery, he deemed it safer for his reputation to leave him to their care. "Doctor, did you hear the widow Biles?" resumed Mrs. Martin. "She says you are always for bleeding." "Only in the incipient stages, Mrs. Martin, before I hear the whiz of the internal wheel that I spoke of. Take the patient at that moment, and a dash at the temporal artery replaces the band. But I fear this is now too late, and besides, you have probably done everything that would have a tendency to put the machine again in order." "We have done nothing," said Mrs. Martin. "Absolutely nothing. I'm ashamed to say it." But the widow Biles was so opposed to anything likely to— "Opposed!" cried the widow. "How can you say so? Didn't I advise a dose of thoroughwort the moment I entered?" "Think of that, Dr. Snaggs," rejoined Mrs. Martin. "Now, was there ever? Only think of thoroughwort, when hyssop has so much more vartue in it." "Dr. Snaggs," vociferated the widow, "isn't thoroughwort a great deal more sarching?" "Mrs. Biles, it is a most excellent febrifuge. It is like oiling the gudgeon." "There," exclaimed the widow triumphantly. Dr. Snaggs demanded her rival. "What do you think of hyssop?" "Mrs. Martin, it is a most excellent febrifuge. It is like oiling the gudgeon." "There, I knew so. And now, doctor, which would you give in Master Tuttle's case?" The doctor hesitated a little, and pressed harder upon the cane. He was aware that each had her advocates, that there were Biolites and Martinites. He was aware, too, that no physician could practise in Tabbyville with any hope of success unless patronized by each of the contending powers. He had some faint recollection, moreover, of having read about a certain Scylla and Charybdis. Instead, therefore, of giving a direct answer, he began to expatiate on the virtues of the vegetable kingdom, and then endeavored to change the subject by alluding to the epidemic at the lower corner. But Mrs. Martin was not to be eluded so easily. She had the organ of perseverance, and brought him back to the question at issue. "Well," said the doctor, "medical writers affirm, and here I certainly agree with them, that in affections of the cerebrum they should give freely of hyssop." "There," screamed Mrs. Martin. "But," continued he, "in affections of the cerebellum they should give freely of thoroughwort." "There," shouted her rival. "But in the case of Master Tuttle, as disease appears to be seated in both organs, I shall prepare a decoction of both herbs, and either mix or minister alternate doses." As he concluded, he rolled his eyes in the direction of Mrs. Martin, and then back again in the direction of the widow Biles. He saw at a glance that his opinion was satisfactory to all concerned, that he was safe, and resolved on keeping so. He pulled out his watch, started up as he noticed the hour, and remarked that the situation of a distant patient rendered his immediate departure necessary. "I have this to console me," he added as he closed the door. "I couldn't possibly leave Master Tuttle in safer hands." "What a treasure we have in Dr. Snaggs," said Mrs. Martin. "A real treasure," responded the widow. Chapter 4. Notwithstanding the combined virtues of hyssop and thoroughwort, Master Tuttle's cerebral excitement continued for several days after the consultation, when it was followed by such complete exhaustion that the abdominal regions became torpid, and the chorister himself, with returning consciousness, was convinced that his days were numbered. "My dear," said he to his distressed wife, who had remained constantly by his couch during his illness, "my dear, I am approaching my finale, and that speedily. Mora turis, moratura moraturum, as I say to my scholars. But I shall leave you with our good parson here, in whom you will always find a friend and adviser. Parson, be kind to Dolly for my sake. To be sure, she and I have not always formed a perfect chord, and on the whole I am glad of it. A dissonance now and then is according to the principles of the art. It heightens the effect. A matrimonial duet, parson, made up altogether of thirds and fifths, would be as insipid as small beer. Now, Dolly, furnished an occasional seventh. Poor Mrs. Tuttle knew nothing of music, but she felt that his expressions were those of kindness, and she sobbed audibly. Master Tuttle, replied the parson, as it regards your wife, I shall endeavour to imitate your example in that respect, and I trust in most others you have the consolatory reflection of having discharged your duty. I've always endeavoured to, responded Tuttle. I think, parson, you always found me in the gallery on the Sabbath and on Fast and Thanksgiving Day. Always. And in selecting the tune, you always found me adapting the sound to the sentiment. Always. Yes, Parson Briggs, no man can say that when you gave out your old favourite, naked as from the earth we came, I ever tried it in Majesty or Sherburne. Yes, I believe I can say that in psalmody I am at home. Domus, Dovus, we, Domi, as I say to my scholars, poor fellows, how they will miss me in the classics. They will indeed, Master Tuttle, but give yourself no uneasiness on their account. We shall endeavour to find one who will be faithful to his trust, and who will water the seed you planted, but who can fill my place in the choir, and what will be said of the dedication if they should fail in the anthem. Ah, parson, an awful responsibility rests on the chorister upon that day, but why lament when I myself shall hear such glorious sounds, when I shall be with Tubal Cain and David and Asaph and Handel and Billings and Maxim? I trust, rejoined his friend, that you will be where the weary are at rest. Rest, rest, cried Tuttle. That reminds me of the anthem. There are 15 bars rest in the part assigned to Captain Tarbox, and he will be sawing away, and upon the wrong chord too. There must be another rehearsal, and it must be here under my direction. Husband, you must not think of it. You are too weak for such a trial, and you need repose. Wife, my fame rests upon that anthem. Do you think I could rest in my grave while Tarbox was grinding ad libitum? Ah, here's Dr. Snaggs. Tell me if Slocum has arrived yet. Why tarry the wheels of his chariot, when not only the alto but the viol must devolve on him? He is below, said Snaggs, but as you needed a little quiet, I thought it best that he should remain there. You did, eh? And this you call smoothing my dying pillow? Pulvinaris, as I say to my scholars. Doctor, I must have another drill on the anthem. I owe it to the name of Tuttle. I will have another drill, so get your instrument and bring here Captain Tarbox and Snoodles and the choir. It was in vain that Dr. Snaggs remonstrated, that the parson entreated, that Mrs. Tuttle wept. On this point he was obstinate, and was in such distress at their reluctance to gratify him, that it was at last deemed advisable to call them in. Now raise me up, exclaimed the chorister, when the members of the orchestra, who had been a long time in assembling, and still longer in the endeavour to get in tune, at last made their appearance, followed by a number of the choir. Joe Slocum, this is kind, said he, as he attempted to grasp his hand. I've had you constantly at my mind's eye, ever since our meeting at the Mug and Poker. Alas, there we shall meet no more. But on your return, I charge you to take one mug to the memory of Tuttle. And Joe, mind and tell the Major to give her a good bead. And now, my friends, as the time is short, let us sound. There, Captain Tarbox, you are too flat. Another turn on the A, there. And Captain Tarbox, bear in mind that on the passage we will go, you have 15 bars rest. Aye, said Tarbox, I am to ground on the bar. And now, resumed the chorister, let us commence the symphony, largo et affectuoso. This, together with the duet and trio, was then executed with tolerable correctness, and had a sensible effect on Master Tuttle. It seemed to reanimate him, for his eye exhibited an uncommon lustre, and his head at the commencement of each bar moved regularly forward, like that of the Chinese mandarin of the toy shop. Che et pia, continued he, as Slocum was preparing to sing his alto solo. The words were, peace be within these walls, and although his manner was directly the reverse of that suggested by Tuttle, and with a twang exceedingly nasal, yet such was the accuracy of his time that he drew from the composer an approving nod. Friends, said the latter, you have done well, but recollect that we are now to begin the chorus, the grand chorus, without which the rest is nothing, and upon which my fame as a composer must float down to posterity. Don't forget to begin with the rising beat, and especially to bear lively upon the parts. Commence, good, forte, excellent, lively upon the parts, plenteousness, within thy palaces, lively, lively, hallelujah. There was an unearthly shriek. He fell backward with his lips quivering, as if struggling to prolong the shout. His uplifted arm dropped powerless, and Tuttle was no more. Portland, Maine. End of section 4.
Section 5 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. A Tale of Boston in Olden Time. But who art thou, with the shadowy locks o'er thy pale young brow, and the world of dreamy gloom that flies in the misty depth of thy soft dark eyes? Thou hast loved, fair girl, thou hast loved too well. Thou art mourning now o'er a broken spell. Thou hast poured thy heart's rich treasures forth, and art unrepaid for thy priceless worth. Hemon. In a retired avenue in the rear of Washington Street, and near the ever-to-be-remembered Old South, stands a venerable pile, surmounted by the uncouth figure of a grim son of the forest, yet known as the Province House. This building was once the gay headquarters of the Commander-in-Chief of England's colonial troops. Yes, that antique relic of a departed age, where now the busy and important Cit resorts to enjoy his Havana, and recruit his temporal man with life's luxuries, was in olden time the proud court of a king's military ambassador. Some 6 months after the incidents preceding, were seated round a table in this mansion a few gay young officers of the English army. Mirth and hilarity seemed to reign triumphant. Among the number, not the least conspicuous, sat Lord Arthur B. And if the human face divine be an index of the heart, he would have been pronounced the happiest one of the group. "My Lord of B," said young Colonel G., a conceited and good-humoured officer, "what a lucky dog are yon! And then the mortification and envy you have caused a score of others by your good fortune. 'Pon honour, I was just on the point of attempting an assault upon her myself, a lovely wife, and what is better, a plum by the way of settlement on your marriage, a fine prospect for a king's officer in the cursed Yankee land. I wish to heaven there was another wealthy and beautiful loyal nymph hereabouts. I would make her happy, as I live, for we have nothing else to lay siege to at present." A roar of merriment followed the colonel's confident speech. "My gallant colonel," said a more grave major, "I fear you will never succeed in your feminine sieges. You'll always get the lucre foremost in the articles of war. Believe me, you will never gain a damsel's heart by counting her daddy's breeches pocket." "Don't be too hard, my good major. My mind wanders to that which is most needed. These Yankee sharpers can drain British purses, even though they excel in nothing else. But let us drop this, and drink to the fair Miss L. and our Lord Arthur, not forgetting the approaching festivity, which, thank heaven, will be one bright spot in our career." We leave this merry company and return to the quarters of Lord B. Seated on a couch in his apartment is the youthful messenger Eugene. But how changed since the eventful night of his arrival! A few months of deep corroding anguish had wrought a fearful contrast in his form. The jetty and short curling hair is thrown aside, and from the fair brow flow luxuriant locks of beautiful auburn. The flashing, tearful eyes, the flushing cheeks, the firmly closed lips, and heaving bosom reveal to the reader the ardent, devoted Lady Julia. Near at hand stands, regarding her with respectful look, the valet Ralph. After a long and agonizing indulgence in her woe, the lady raised her head and spoke. "For this painful confirmation of my suspicions I thank thee, my kind Ralph. Now that his falsehood is truly unmasked, now that I feel he has filled my cup of bitterness to the brim, I will witness with my own eyes these blasting events to my own young hopes. Oh, Ralph, what have I not sacrificed for this man, this base-hearted monster? Have I not suffered exile from my native land, and passed even the bounds of my sex to behold his smile, to breathe the same air that is charmed by his presence? Have I not sacrificed home, friends, comfort, perhaps my own proud name, for this false wretch?" "True, madam. But cannot your feigned report of loss and fortune, and your great distance, the long period since his leaving England, be some atonement for his master's untruth?" "No, Ralph, this will not atone for wrongs like mine. It was but a foolish romantic whim of mine to witness its effect on him. For this I bore to him my own letters, and oh, the love and devotion he showed on my thirsty spirit on that night of our meeting. Little knew he who listened and feasted on his every word. Had she fond delusion of that night existed unbroken for one short week, how gladly would I have thrown off all disguise and surrendered myself, my fortune, and my whole soul to him. But to be thus cast off, slighted and forgotten, shall the last of my proud and ancient line be thrown aside by him who once thought, lived, and breathed but in my presence, and all this for an acquaintance of an hour? No, Ralph, I have fed upon his bounty like a dog, and of late his very brute has had more smiles and looks than the neglected and despised Eugene. But I have passed the bounds of maiden honor. From shame and an insulted spirit there is no retreat. There yet remains revenge, revenge such as women's wrongs and women's hearts can only dream. My kind Ralph, you have been faithful to me. Be silent, get and leave." Another flood of scalding tears burst from her wild and flashing eyes, and she bent her aching head upon the couch in silent agony. Bright and joyous was the festival scene on the night destined for the marriage of Lord Arthur B. and the lovely Miss H. Her father's mansion was filled with fair ladies and gay officers of the king, and the bright lamp shone o'er bright women and brave men. Sweet music filled the hall, and proud figures, clad in scarlet and gold, blended with those of virgin whiteness, flirted through the mazy figures of the giddy dance. All present appeared joyful and light-hearted save one. In the deep recess of a window stood a pale boy. An unnatural brightness beamed from his dark eyes, yet he seemed not to note the gaiety before him. The gushing melody that floated through the brilliant apartment, and the ringing laugh of youth, fell not in gladness on his ear. There was no room for these bright joys within the bursting heart of that lone boy. The hour for the ceremony drew near, but where are the happy beings for whom this festival circle is gathered? In a secluded arbor of the garden sat a youthful couple, conversing in a low and confidential tone. And how many blissful dreams of the future, and what high and happy hopes urged their delusive visions on the mind of that young pair. They are waited for at the altar. The aged father of the young bride approaches Eugene. "Tell thy master that the hour is at hand." The boy startled like one awakened from a dream. He looked around with a wild amazement, then answered in a voice of hoarse, unearthly tone, "I will." The agony expressed in these brief words rang strangely on the happy group around. The boy had vanished. Suddenly a shriek rang through the mansion that blanched the blood from many a lovely cheek. all rushed to the arbor. The young nobleman lay stretched upon the earth. The life's blood gushed from his heart, tingling with yet deeper shade his crimson attire. Sinking by his side was the slight figure of the youth, his open garments revealing the white bosom of a female, with the undrawn dagger yet flashed within its faintly throbbing heart. With the last exertion of fleeting life, she exclaimed, "This is my revenge! This is the fearful price of a blighted name, or woman's wrongs." The bodies of these victims of broken truth were borne to their far distant land. The fair Emma H. has long since been laid in the family vault of ancient copse. All has since changed, save certainly that mankind are prone to falsehood, and that vows, like bubbles, are easily broken as made. End of section 5. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 6 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6. The Shoemaker and His Two Wives, by Elizabeth Oakes Smith. Everybody was pitying Mr. Sampson, the shoemaker of the village of B. Now, gentle reader, you need not guess Brunswick, nor Bethel, nor Bloomfield, nor any other village beginning with a B, for I will assure you beforehand you won't guess right. Nobody knows the identical place beginning with a B except the writer. Well, everybody was pitying the shoemaker, and as he passed daily by my window on his way to his little workshop, I involuntarily drew down my face in token of commiseration, though why I should do it I could not for my life have explained. But everybody said he was an unhappy man, a miserable man, that his wife almost scolded his life out of him, that she was the biggest scold in the country, beat Xantippe of classical memory all hollow, that in her fits of passion she whisked the poor shoemaker about very much like a West India bamboo in a tropical hurricane. Never was such a scold. Her tongue might be heard the first thing in the morning and the last at night. She was so constantly scolding, she would never take time to die, so the poor shoemaker's misery seemed interminable. All the men were telling how they would manage her if they had her for a wife, and when a half-dozen of them collected at a farmer's house, the shoemaker's wife was often the theme, and many were the modes of punishment devised by those who had not the shrew to deal with. It might generally be observed on such occasions that those who were suspected of being henpecked, now fortified by the numbers present, generally talked most valiantly how they would manage the shoemaker's wife if she belonged to them, now and then casting furtive glances at their bustling good wives present. But it was plain to be seen the women did not relish this theme when discussed by the men. They would talk pathetically of the shoemaker's grievances among themselves, talk eloquently of the misery a man must suffer in being tied to such a termagant. But no sooner did an unlucky husband attempt to harp upon the same string than touch a hornet's nest. All the women were out with palliatives, and warm in the defense of the shoemaker's wife. Every woman had her peculiar trials. Mrs. Sampson, no doubt, had hers as well as others. She had no flesh on her bones and was as yellow as saffron. It was plain she was a sick woman. Mr. Sampson appeared pleasant enough outdoors, but for all that, he might be a tyrant at home. Thus was poor Mrs. Sampson defended, in spite of her tongue. But whatever they felt called upon to say in behalf of Mrs. Sampson in the presence of their husbands, their sympathies were actually altogether on the side of Mr. Sampson. Every good wife wreathed her face into the most becoming smile when she accosted Mr. Sampson, merely out of instinctive good nature. Far be it from me to insinuate that it was to contrast with the thin lips and sour visage of his own good wife. Seeing this state of things, I began naturally to study the countenance of the poor man as he passed my window, in order to read the lines of care, the furrows of misery, and cringing air of a henpecked man. But, truth to say, no such things were to be seen. He generally passed with a careless, sturdy tread, humming a tune or picking his teeth. As for wrinkles, his hale, good-natured, handsome face looked as if it might bid defiance to them for many a year to come. His bright, open eye looked as if it had never twinkled with anything but good humor, and instead of being the most miserable, I at once sat him down for the happiest man in the village of B. No one bought oftener gingerbread and candy for his children, or new gowns for his wife. When arm in arm they trudged along to meeting on a Sunday, no man seemed more busily to chat with his wife, and no woman looked prouder of her husband. The secret seemed to be in his having good-naturedly accommodated himself to the disposition of his wife, without compromising his own independence. After all, it depends less upon external circumstances than on our own disposition, whether we are happy or miserable in this life. In process of time, the shoemaker's wife died, leaving her husband to follow her to the grave with as many children as followed Mr. Rogers to the stake. And whether that were 9 or 10, the reader must determine. Contrary to the expectations of everyone, Mr. Sampson mourned long and truly for his wife. She had been a thrifty housewife and a neat, careful mother, and so used were husband and children to her severe discipline that it was doubtful whether they would know how to act without it. But sorrow, like all other things in the sublunary world, must have an end. The children were growing disorderly, and were losing that tidy appearance that had always characterized them. Nothing in the shoemaker's snug domicile went right. The good housewives in the village of B were busy in making a second match for poor Mr. Sampson, and like prudent women, they all pitched upon one the very antipodes of poor Mrs. Sampson, who was dead and gone. Susan Gowan was mild, good-natured, and smart, and all eyes were turned upon her as the future Mrs. Sampson. She was just the right age, had a little property, and all declared he could never do better. And Mr. Sampson, like a reasonable man, believed what everybody said, and married her. This time at least, the neighbors had no reason to complain. The second Mrs. Sampson was a mirror of patience. The neighbors who happened in about mealtime could find no fault with the bread and butter, the last article being thick enough to satisfy the most captious. And as for pie or cake, all declared hers were no mother-in-law pieces. The shoemaker must and would be happy. Months passed away, and if the predictions of the neighbors were to be verified, Mr. Sampson's appearance was somewhat equivocal for a happy man. It was certain that he grew thin, did not whistle or laugh or hum half so often as he used to do. His step was listless, and he seemed to have lost much of that sturdy activity which had formerly distinguished him. The neighbors were completely at a stand. Mrs. Sampson was strictly scrutinized, but nothing could be detected. She was patience personified. Meanwhile, the children, accustomed to the severe discipline of their mother, no sooner found themselves subjected to the milder sway of a stepmother, whose right to control them was, to say the least, doubtful, since public opinion has made it such, now burst free from all restraint, and reveled in the glorious privilege of doing whatever they had a mind to do. Poor Mrs. Sampson talked, and coaxed, and wept, and in 1 or 2 instances even had the temerity to put a motherless child down cellar, all to no purpose. They were as unmanageable as a parcel of wild colts broken free from the pasture, and antic with the first consciousness of freedom. Mr. Sampson could not manage them. That was out of the question. He had never thought of doing it while their mother was alive, and how could he now that she was dead and gone? Among the trials awarded to the patriarch Job, it is well perhaps that his sex precluded the possibility of his passing the ordeal of a mother-in-law's lot. So thought the second Mrs. Sampson. She had tried everything, and now her patience was completely exhausted. One day, just as her husband was coming in to dinner, driven to desperation by the accumulated din of so many ungovernable children, she suddenly armed herself with a handful of hemlock tops and laid them about her on every side, at the same time ordering every child to a seat about the quickest. At this moment her husband entered, and far from flinching, she resolutely told him what she had done and what she meant to do in future, ere she would endure such an intolerable din. Mr. Sampson was at once in fine spirits. His wife had never looked half so handsome before. The children were as whist as mice in a cheese. Mrs. Sampson absolutely kept her word, and though the neighbors pitied the children and talked mournfully of the sorrows of poor Mr. Sampson, from that time he began to gain in flesh and spirits, and became the sturdy, good-natured sort of a man I had formerly known him. The recurrence of the old stimulus in the activity of a wife's tongue had restored the buoyancy to his spirits and health to his bones. Such being the fact, I thought it best to write his history, in the hope that persons witnessing a similar case would suspend their sympathies and reflect that after all, the husband of a scolding wife may be as happy as that of a good-natured one, and the spirited tones of her voice in scolding may be quite as agreeable to such a husband's ear as the most dulcet notes of the other in trilling a fashionable air. End of section 6. Read by ZacharyJ in Boise, October 23rd, 2021.
Section 7 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 7, Rustic Courtship in New England. "You see, ma'am," said the old man, "my mother died when I was 12 years old. About that time old Mr. C came down and set up for a great marchant. Well, his wife took sick, and she was sent back to where she came from, for a widow woman to come and take care of her. This widow woman had 3 children. Her husband had been a seafaring man, and he had been wrecked and lost down there at Halifax, and left his wife with nothing at all, and these 3 children to take care of. Well, my daddy, ma'am, fell in love with her, somehow or other, and married her. She was a nice woman, as good a mother as ever was, and she had great learning, and knew how to do everything, only she didn't know nothing about country work, you see. Well, her oldest daughter came down, for my dad had agreed to take one of the children, and she was a nice gal. And a while after the boy came down. Well, there was nothing said, we all worked along, and the daughter she got married to Mr. H. You know his folks. He broke his neck afterwards, falling from his horse. Well, a while after this, t'other daughter came down. Debbie was dreadful plain. I thought she was dreadful plain, but she was a nice gal, smart working, and good to everybody. You see, there were 4 young children in the second crop, and they had got ragged, and Debbie spun and wove and clothed and mended them up. Well, she went back, but they couldn't live without her, and sent for her again, and so she came. She took care of everything, sorted my things and had them all in order, and everything comfortable for me in the winter when I went in the woods. But I thought nothing no more than if she'd been my sister. Well, by this time I was a youngish man, and in my day the young folks had a sort of frolic every night. I used to go, and sometimes went home with one gal, sometimes with another, but never thought of Debbie. Well, there was a Mr. Blank came to see her, but she wouldn't have nothing to say to him. And after that one came from the Shoals, a rich man's son. His father gave him a complete new vessel and everything to load her, but Debbie wouldn't have nothing to do with him neither. Then I wasn't worth so much as this stick. Well, I wondered, and so I says to Mother, "Mother, what's the reason Debbie won't take this man? She'll never better herself." "Don't you know, John?" says Mother. "No." So I says to Debbie, "Why don't you have him, Debbie?" "Because," says Debbie, says she, "if I can't have the one I want, I won't have nobody." Well, I thought nothing, but went on frolicking here and frolicking there, till one night as I was going home, just towards day, with one of my mates, says I, "Tom," says I won't go to another frolic these 2 months. If I do, I'll give you $1. "You," he says, "you'll go afore 2 nights." "Well, you'll see," says I. Well, I stayed at home steady, and after a while, says Father, says he to Mother, "Susie," says he, for that was the way he always spoke to her, "Susie," says he, "I guess John has got tired of raking about so, and I'm glad of it." "I hope he has," says Mother. Well, one day we were sitting at table. Mother sat there, and Father sat there, and the hired man next to him, for we had a hired man and a hired gal, and Debbie was next to Mother, and the gal next, and I between the hired man and the hired gal. Well, Mother was joking the hired man and gal. She was a great hand to joke. And I cast an eye at Debbie, and I thought, I never seen anybody alter as you have, Debbie. She looked handsome. Well, Debbie was weaving upstairs, and I was mowing down by the well close to the house, and I felt kind of uneasy, and made an excuse to go in for a drink of water. Well, I went in, and I went upstairs and into t'other chamber, not the one where Debbie was weaving, for I was kind of bashful, you see, and then I went in where Debbie was, but said nothing, for I had never laid the weight of my finger on the gal in my life. At last, "Debbie," says I, "what sort of a weaver are you, Debbie?" "Oh, I guess I can get off as many yards as anybody," says she, "and I want to get my web out and go up on the bill to Sister's this afternoon." "Well," says I, "tell her to have something nice, for I shall be up there." "We shan't see you there, I guess," says Debbie. "You will, though," says I, "see if you don't." Father had a great pasture on the hill, a kind of farm like, for my father was a rich man. So just afore night up I goes, and they had everything in order. So a while after supper I says to Debbie, "'Tis time for us to go, for 'twill be milking time by the time we get home." So we went right down across, and on the way we talked the business over. I married her, and a better wife never wore shoe leather. End of section 7. Reading by Alan Mapstone.
Section 8 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 8. The Confession of Grotius. Grotius was a great man. His natural powers were such that at the age of 15 he made a vast proficiency in polite literature. and he pleaded at the bar when only 17. At the age of 24, he was appointed Attorney General. He became a public ambassador and was the companion of kings. Toward the close of his life, in his 62nd year, reflecting on his various pursuits, he left this testimony for the admonition of the learned. Alas, I have wasted my whole life in laboriously doing nothing. End of Section 8. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 9 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26, edited by Seba Smith and Labree. Section 9, Origin of Genius. Columbus was the son of a weaver, and a weaver himself. Rabelais, son of an apothecary. Claude Lorient was bred a pastry cook. Molière, son of a tapestry maker. Cervantes served as a common soldier. Homer was a beggar. Hesiod was the son of a small farmer. Demosthenes of a cutler. Terence was a slave. Richardson was a printer. Oliver Cromwell, the son of a brewer. Howard, an apprentice to a grocer. Benjamin Franklin, a journeyman printer. Dr. Thomas, Bishop of Worcester, son of a linen draper. Daniel Defoe was a hosier and the son of a butcher. Whitfield, son of an innkeeper. Gloucester, Sir Cloudesley Shovel, Rear Admiral of England, was an apprentice to a shoemaker and afterward a cabin boy. Bishop Prideaux worked in the kitchen at Exeter College, Oxford. Gardiner Wolsey, son of a butcher. Ferguson was a shepherd. Niebuhr was a peasant. Thomas Paine, son of a stay maker at Thetford. Dean Tucker was a son of a small farmer in Cartingshire and performed his journeys to Oxford on foot. Edward Haley was the son of a soap boiler at Shoreditch. Joseph Hall, Bishop of Norwich, son of a farmer at Ashby-le-Zouch. William Hogarth was put in apprentice to an engraver of pewter pots. Dr. Mountain, Bishop of Durham, was the son of a beggar. Lucian was the son of a statuary. Virgil of a potter. Horace of a shopkeeper. Plautus a baker. Shakespeare the son of a wool stapler. Milton of a money scrivener. Cowley, son of a hatter. Samuel Butler, son of a farmer. Ben Jonson worked for some time as a bricklayer. Robert Burns was a ploughman in Ayrshire. Thomas Chatterton, son of a sexton of Redcliffe Church. Bristol, Thomas Gray was the son of a scrivener. Matthew Pryor, son of a joiner in London. Henry Kirke White, son of a butcher at Nottingham. Bloomfield and Clifford were shoemakers. Addison, Goldsmith, Otway, and Annie were sons of clergymen. Porson, son of a parish clerk. End of section 9. Section 10 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26, edited by Seba Smith and Labree. Section 10, Man and Woman. There is a moral depravity, a coarse licentiousness in the nature of man that is wholly foreign from the female character, and of which nothing is stronger proof than the unvarying constancy with which women will adhere to the objects of her early attachments, even after they excite nothing but disgust in every other bosom. Man, on the contrary, is seldom permanently attached, but he can turn aside and daily, through mere wantonness, with any wandering waif who may cross his path, and the world only smiles at his folly. Woman shrinks with intuitive dread from the libertine glance, and it is only from man, never from her own heart, that she learns to become at once the object of his eager pursuit and his scoff. and no sooner does she lose that immediate jewel of her soul, self-respect, than to silence the sensitive consciousness of her nature, she plunges into the profoundest depths of vice. Man is different. A cloud may darken for a period his mental vision, but the first ray that gleams from the sun of prosperity or ambition or any other leading motive of life will dispel the gloom, and he proceeds in his career of business or pleasure as if naught had occurred to darken his moral horizon. A crushed heart on which he has trod with a heel of iron may be sobbing away its last breath in an atmosphere of pollution, and he heed it not. Why did she not respect herself? He triumphantly asks, and then I would have respected her also. The world echoes the sentiment, and the self-condemned, self-accused wretch sinks away from the cold sneer of untried virtue to the oblivion of infamy. Her murderer probably stands in the hall of legislation or the temple of justice, and his sycophants point him out as a godlike man. End of section 10.
Section 11 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 11, Content, by C.D. Stuart. How little we need, with a heart that is free from the chidings of guilt and the blightings of care. How blessed is our lot, and how happy were we, if content with the gifts that are sent us to share. The food and the raiment our bodies require, and all that makes smiling the fane and the hearth, like the water that gushed at the prophet's desire, arise at our touch from the breast of the earth. 'Tis but little we need, if the hands that are well were put to the toil for an hour in a day, and a union of hearts would for ever expel all doubting, mistrusting, and sorrow away. The birds in the air and the fish in the wave, the beasts of the forest, the leaf and the flower, have ever enjoyed what the Great Spirit gave, been contented and happy their brief little hour. What more do our bodies require than their own, which God has not given wherever we go? It is only the Spirit alone, which has wants that can never be sated below. And a heaven is nigh to the thirst of the soul, so there's nothing, nothing ungiven we need, if content to be mortal while earth is our goal, not angels till life from its prison is freed. End of section 11, read by Alan Mapstone.
Section 12 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 12, How to Cook a Husband. The lady editress of the Boston Transcript said that many of our married lady readers are not aware how a good husband ought to be cooked, so as to make a good dish of him. We have lately seen a recipe in an English paper, contributed by one Mary, which points out the modus operandi of preparing and cooking husbands. Mary states that a good many husbands are spoiled in cooking. Some women go about it as if their lords were bladders and blow them up. Others keep them constantly in hot water, while others, again, freeze them by conjugal coldness. Some smother them in the hottest beds of contention and variance, and some keep them in pickle all their lives. These women always serve them up in sauce. Now it cannot be supposed that husbands will be tender and good, managed in this way, but they are, on the contrary, quite delicious when preserved. Mary points out her manner thus: get a jar, called the jar of cheerfulness, which by the by all wives had at hand. Being placed in it, set him near the fire of conjugal love. Let the fire be pretty hot, but especially let it be clear. Above all, let the heat be regular and constant. Cover him over with quantities of affection, kindness, and subjection. Keep plenty of these things by you, and be very attentive to supply the place of any that may waste by evaporation or any other cause. Garnish with modest becoming familiarity and innocent pleasantry, and if you add kisses or other confectionaries, accompany them with a sufficient secrecy, and it would not be amiss to add a little prudence and moderation. End of section 12.
Section 13 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. Edited by Seba Smith and Labree. Section 13. Letters from Town to Country. My dear Colonel, excuse my foolscap. You know I was always very partial to the bells, and as the two have always been associated, I use them together. Madame the milliner has returned to town, and what is very wonderful, her daughter is still in the singular number. I never before knew a beauty of such pleasing manners who did not take at Saratoga. I fear me much the two ex-presidents have monopolized all the attentions. Be that as it may, Agnes begins her third winter at the Apollo as a candidate for Hyman's prize. Julia, the youngest, who has been a fixture at the piano for the last 3 years, is soon to be brought out. If she is not brought out in better style than she has been brought up, she will by no means be the eclipse of the season. Before she be marred further, some roaming Philip had better forestall the issue. In a 12-month the discount may be large. I enjoyed a delightful picnic last week at Yonkers. Your humble servant was the only bachelor in the group, and I flatter him when I say he done the amiable to the satisfaction of several ladies whose husbands were tied to musty ledgers and moth-eaten accounts. Mrs. W. was of the party, and the radiance of her smiles amply compensated for the presence of several black clouds above us, which shielded the sun. Yet I do not know whether I enjoyed most the sparkle of her wit or the grand champagne from her husband's vault. She is a most inveterate punster. Whether she hooked them or not, I cannot say, but really they were the best I have heard from any woman's rosy portal. Speaking of Amelia, your quondam love, she asked me if I thought your condition at N was ameliorated more than usual. I told her I thought it was, since the old sergeant refused to allow her to have her way any longer. However, I told her I still owed her one. Captain S. sang from Somnambula, False One, I Love the Still. It was performed in rather a boisterous manner, and my fair neighbor whispered me that however false the captain might prove, she would always love him still. I am before you this time in the gossip of the day. Your old flame, Charlotte, has married at the West. The unlucky fellow is a Mr. Wicks. Her own wick was rather short, and having gained a new one, she has relighted it from Hyman's torch, is no more afloat. Ah, my dear Colonel, your sighs and dollars were alike thrown away in that quarter. I told you long ago she was a flirt, and had you taken my advice, your heartstrings and purse strings would have been much better off. But console yourself with the thought that you are not the only victim. General S., of Dutchess County, if he had a crop injured by a rust or long rains, would never murmur, provided his neighbors were damaged equally with him. Unlike the Pharisee, he thanked heaven he was not worse than other men, but I never could appreciate his feelings. You may, however, in the case of your unfortunate love. I do detest coquetry. If it is lamentable when observed upon the part of the ladies, how contemptible is it when engaged in by gentlemen. Yet there are many of the so-called latter class who make it their practice, and even boast of their conquests among their companions at the billiard table. I can pardon vanity in a woman, for I regard it as a weakness, but I despise it in a man. It should be accounted an unpardonable sin. Give me credit for an act of humanity. I have just killed a mosquito. Truly, the Humane Society should vote me a medal, since the flood and consequent inundation of metropolitan cellars these charming musicians have greatly increased, and it would be a horrible thing to have them at the same time with the yellow fever. The old women have been quite lively this last week, because there was great talk of the scourge of the South, who, it is alleged, is airing himself below you at the round-out. However, I believe it will prove a false alarm. Apropos of the flood, Noah, you know, once sent out a messenger in the shape of a dove to find dry land. So our old friend, who in late years paid his devoirs to the Evening Star, having been a long time searching for dry land, has also sent out his messenger, and a very dove-like appearance it makes in these times. A subterranean has recently set his foot upon the shores of Gotham, and has come prepared to rumble in a slight degree over the heads of the sovereign people, or, as Hook would say, the half-crown people, to come out of enigmas. It is a weekly paper edited by that independent son of Thermopylae, Michael Walsh, Esquire. He suffers very few rogues through the pass, and few escape the thunderbolts which his industrious pen concocts in his sanctum. I spoke in my last of Mitchell. His bandbox is now uncovered for a long and successful campaign. He will make ready as well as Simpson, though he is not so good a price. I see he has lost his Tim. However, he is none the less timid of success, I presume. I see his white hat occasionally, and it has lost none of its luster. It has no British luster to lose. It knows it not. Now, my dear Colonel, don't forget to gather the chestnuts for me at the first frost. I would prefer those from the old veteran at the corner of the pasture. It will revive old scenes to taste its fruit. Besides, I prefer the fruit which age yields, and wish none of that which is the offspring of precocious maturity. Apropos of the latter, young B. is still engaged in writing poetry, and pestering me with dedications, etc., etc. If you have any influence with his doting mamma, do persuade her to reinstate him in the office of gardener. He will find the earth much more fertile than his genius, and yielding, too, a much better crop. For authorship, in these times, is a starving employment, unless the man of letters is a student and scholar. You will recollect, probably, what a mania there was for authorship among the Cephs when we were both enjoying amusement and instruction under the old elms in the more classic shades of Yale. Every soph who could wield his grey goose would disfigure his scores of foolscap sheets in a futile attempt to adorn the pages of the college literary with some verses to Julia and an occasional ode to Venus, with sometimes, by way of variety, a prosaic face-time upon that freshman's long swallow. But as the sapient senior editor adjudged that beauty, when unadorned, was adorned the most, 3/4 of their stuff was consigned to the professor of dust and ashes, to which latter personage if you have still the functionary about, you may present this effusion of your humble servant, who has roved pretty extensively in the enclosed. Pay me what thou owest by the next poet, or never mind. Jacob Matter of Fact, Loafers Lodge, number September 8, 1843. End of section 13. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida. Section 14 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Greg Giordano. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. Edited by Seba Smith and Labree. Section 14. The Close of the Volume. The present number completes the first volume of The Rover, comprising 26 numbers, or half a year. The first number of the second volume is in type, and will appear at the usual time next week, embellished with a new and beautiful frontispiece, engraved expressly for opening the volume. The publication of The Rover was a novel and untried experiment, a weekly magazine of 16 large octavo pages, filled with choice reading, in neat printed covers, and each number embellished with an elegant fine steel engraving, at the unprecedented low price of 6 cents a number, was something new in the periodical literature of the country. The experiment was a hazardous one, under any circumstances, but eminently so when undertaken, as in this case, by persons without capital, or scarcely anything to rely upon for assistance but the hands and the intellect which God and nature had given them. But the experiment has been tried, and proved successful. We are by no means prone to boasting. We don't believe in the value of the article, but we cannot refrain from expressing the grateful sense we feel for the favorable reception the public have given to The Rover. In 6 months from its commencement, it has reached a circulation to place it on a permanent basis. It is conducted entirely on the cash system, and the cash sales every week now exceed the whole weekly expenses. Back numbers, bound and unbound, full sets of the first volume of The Rover, can now be had at the office, either in single numbers or bound in volume. The first 3 numbers were some time since exhausted and had to be reprinted. This has now been done, and the publishers will be able to supply back numbers from the commencement probably for some weeks to come. The next volume. Agents and newsmen are requested to send in as early as possible their orders for commencing the second volume, that the edition to be struck off may be regulated accordingly. On opening the new volume, new attractions will be given to the general appearance of the work, and no pains will be spared to give increasing interest to its contents. End of section 14. Read by Greg Giordano, Newport Richey, Florida.
Section 15 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 26, edited by Seba Smith and Labree. Section 15, Two Correspondents. In this closing number of the first volume of The Rover, it is proper that we should say a word or two to some of the correspondents who have favoured us with communications. We are much obliged to E.K., who has given us Life on the Gulf of Mexico, and hope the writer will find it convenient and agreeable to continue those graphic and lifelike sketches. The author of Blennerhassett, the Lord of the Isle, will accept our thanks. We liked his ballad. Our matter-of-fact friend, who dates from Loafer's Lodge, writes well, and we hope for a better acquaintance. We must say respectfully to Harry L. that, judging from the single specimen we have seen, we do not think poetry is his forte. We have reason to know that in prose he can do better, and should be happy to hear from him. The sonnet kindly sent to us by E.G.S. will soon find a place in the Rover. The lines to Summer by H.B., though some of them are good, have not poetic merit enough for the Rover. Idleness, the subject is too commonplace. The article appears to be written with a good degree of ability, but has hardly interest enough for our pages. The Approach of the Last Day by D is not poetry, and a large portion of it is not rhyme. The Stream of Life, though respectable, we do not think quite so well of as something before from the same author. The writer was too much shackled by the peculiar measure he chose. The Songstress by T.A.G. is laid by for insertion. The author has a good deal of facility for smooth versification. Reminiscences of Russia from the French have not sufficient interest for our pages. End of section 15. Recording by Alan Mapstone. End of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 26, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree.